Okay, thanks Keith, and thanks everybody for bearing with those two papers. I realize I set a puzzle to which I didn't actually know the solution when I set those two papers for our read-ins. So there's a little paper with a quick little punchy argument supposed to help close the distance between all this stuff about access and knowledge and stuff about the more mysterious stuff, apparently qualia. And then there's the other big paper, a kind of architectural proposal about how brains might work. And of course I thought, well, this trip's a great way to get someone else to do the work for me of actually putting those two things together. So I'm glad that Keith has done an awful lot of that work. Perfect presentation of everything. All I think I want to do is kind of just go through what I take to be the sort of the main conceptual kind of icebergs in the argument, and then bring on everybody else. So I think the starting point for all of this for me is a kind of intuition that goes like this. If you take care of the content, the consciousness will take care of itself. So I think that's a kind of guiding intuition, that basically we'll deal with content, and once we've done all the stuff we need to do with content, it'll turn out that there just aren't any puzzles about consciousness left. So that, I think that's that's kind of the starting point. And I think one way to sort of get the feel of that, it's not a demonstrative argument, but something like that is, you know, imagine, if you can, living in a world in which everything looks upside down to you. But in fact, all of your other motor programs and planning programs, etc., are all perfectly tweaked so that you interact with that world perfectly. You can do, you know, you can pick up cups, you can turn over things, pick up forks. I think that we can't sustain the intuition that that is a world that actually looks upside down to us. I think, as it were, the intuition about which way the world looks is just to do with the kind of things that we can do. And I think it's what we know about the world that explains the kinds of things that we can do in it. So that's the kind of, that's basically how these stories are supposed to come together. The idea in the Access Qualia paper really is it's all about knowing what we can do. That basically a certain kind of knowledge about what we can do gives rise to all of these puzzles about qualia. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So I think that's the first thought anyway. Take care of the content and the consciousness will take care of itself. So the other bit, the big paper on predictive coding, is basically an attempt to take care of the content. So the idea is that predictive coding stories give us an angle on the emergence, if you like, of a grip on a structured and meaningful external world. And that, of course, it's a huge paper, it's a big kind of story, and there's all kinds of reasons to be doubtful about the details. But the broad idea is just that that top-down expectation, subpersonal top-down prediction, is playing a huge role in the construction of the contents of our experience. And although in a way that seems obvious, it's actually not been the case that we have theories that systematically take account of that. So, you know, if you open kind of standard textbooks on neuroscience, you will see a nice picture with a kind of a, you know, a retina and arrows going from the retina to the optic chiasm to LGN onwards to primary visual cortex, and, you know, as the sensory information coming in, conscious experience happens somewhere down the end. But of course, it turns out to be the case, as Patrick Winston points out in a nice little paper a couple of years ago. So he was one of the early pioneers of AI. And in the paper a few years ago, he says, well, look, an important thing to notice is, of course, that 80% of the input to LGN comes from places other than the retina. That's a huge amount. 80% of the input that's coming to LGN, this early kind of way station, isn't even coming from the retina. That gives you a sense that there's something wrong with that sort of feed-forward model. I think a lot of people have thought that once you ditch the feed-forward model, you should ditch the hierarchical bit. And I don't think that that's the case. So I think that the criticisms that are out there, good criticisms of feed-forward processing, not good criticisms of hierarchy. So now we just think about the hierarchical stuff slightly differently, basically in terms of a sort of top-down flow, in which what we're trying to do is to successfully predict the sensory barrage that is hitting the retina. So the task of the brain here is to predict the sensory barrage that's hitting the retina, and to predict, or you know, all your bits, but let's take the retina for now, and to predict that barrage as it unfolds at multiple scales of space and time, as it's being processed through this system, which is kind of a multi-time scale kind of system. So you're trying to get to grips with this sensory barrage by predicting it in ways that will enable you to stay on top of it at both very local scales of space and time and at much longer scales. So, you know, at a local scale, if I move my head around, different little bits of light and shade vary, my grip on texture varies. That's quite local, fast variation. But things stay the things they are. The camera in front of me is still a camera. You know, this is still a kind of poley sort of thing. So that's the kind of grip at a slightly longer scale of space and time. My kind of content-y view of conscious experience is that there's nothing more to it and nothing less to it than a grip on a structured external world at multiple scales of space and time. And that's the reason that I'm attracted by the predictive coding stories. I think it gives you that grip. It gives you a grip on a structured external world and also a meaningful external world, because it's a grip which is looking into the future. You know, I, as it were, have to predict how the sensory barrage is going to vary as I do stuff. When I see a little twitch in the corner, then I begin to anticipate the kind of sensory barrage that is associated with someone picking up a tomato and throwing it at me or something. You know, so I'm looking into the future. Bits of the sensory barrage are marked as salient by upping the value of prediction error signals. Don't worry about the details there. But the point is that this is now a meaningful world, if you like. It's looking into the future, and it's looking into the future in a way which is sculpted by whatever's salient to my purposes. So I think, for whatever it's worth, that there's a kind of chance here of a really rich story about the emergence of a structured, meaningful, external realm given to us in knowledge, if you like. This is what we know about when we encounter the world. So that, you might think, well, that's told us something nice about knowledge, but it's left all the stuff about qualia that we all came here to learn about out of the story. And I guess the idea in the short paper is to try to put pressure on that. So the idea is something like, I've only got one color of cup. This isn't good, is it? I wish I had another one. Let's do some imagining, okay? Just imagine that this is a blue cup, and we'll use props from here on. So, okay. So, I show you two cups. These cups look, I say to you, how... Thank you, Paul. Paul's got a good empirical solution. We're a problem here. There we go. So anyway, imagine it's a blue cup. Okay. So one thing that you might say is, you say, okay, that cup's red, that one's blue. And I ask you, how do you know that? You say, I don't know anything about how I know it. It just comes to me. That one's red, that one's blue. Okay, that's one possible case. Another possible case is you know everything about your own processing. So as it happens, you know that you're picking up on certain kind of delicate surface reflectance properties that vary in certain ways. Some of your neural populations are kind of, busily mimicking some of that structure in the external realm. Stuff that Paul was talking about fits in very, very nicely there. But of course there's a third possibility. This is very consistent with what Paul's saying, but as regards your knowledge about what's going on, what you know perhaps is that you're seeing the difference, you're visually aware of this difference, but that's all you know. And under those conditions, I think, if we probe you a bit further, because you're a kind of bright, intelligent animal, we can ask you questions about this stuff, you'll end up having to say something like, well, I'm sorry, they just look different to me. So the kind of thought is that our intuitions about qualia roughly come from there. It's a three bears story about qualia, if you like. The three bears story, it's just the right size, not too much access to your own processing. Then you would be like God, and God clearly doesn't have qualitative experience. God knows far too much for that. If you had no access to your own processing at all, these puzzles wouldn't arise. But we've got just a little bit of access. We know we're solving these problems in certain kinds of way. And then the trick for me has to be to not beg the question. So many of the times when Keith was presenting my story there, I kind of felt that if I'd been hearing that presentation, I would have thought, oh, damn it, Clark begged the question so easily here, because it seemed as if at times you presented the view as if I was saying, we have to detect structure in the visual experience in some way. I don't know. I wrote it down somewhere. Hang on. Right. You said something about find structure within the visual qualia, and of course I daren't say that. What I have to say is we find structure in our own action space. So that's the basic idea here is that it's knowing about our own action space which is going to be used as a vehicle to reconstruct all of these qualitative intuitions that we have. So it's, yeah, it's knowing how I'm currently poised to act in virtue of my informational state, which I think is all that nature really cared about giving us, was knowledge about, as it were, what we can do on the basis of the information available. Okay, maybe I shall leave it there. So that's the kind of idea. Shift all of the weight onto content. Don't worry about consciousness. Give a nice big thick account of content, and maybe you can get that out of predictive coding if you're lucky. That's my hope. And then do something to discharge all of the puzzlement about qualia by maybe saying that, you know, it's the structured external world that is presented to us, but not how we know about that structured external world. And so we become rather puzzled, and we say things like, oh, we just see these differences, we just feel them, taste them, detect them. So that's the kind of idea anyway, and I'll leave it there.